All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you to our wonderful audience here all across Kyrgyzstan for joining us for this talk about elections and what makes an election free and fair. My name is Nolan Johnson. I'm the U.S. Embassy spokesperson. It's a delight to be here with you this evening, and thank you again for taking the time to join us in this important conversation. Tonight, we have two excellent, distinguished guests. First, I'll go to Mr. Noel Bauer. He is the director of the Democracy and Governance Office at the U.S. Agency for International Development Mission of the Kyrgyz Republic. Thank you so much for joining us, Noel.
Happy to be here.
And just a little bit of background on Noel. He, prior to serving here in the Kyrgyz Republic, he has worked for USAID in Ghana, Haiti, and Washington, D.C., and he was also a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mozambique. And, that brings us to our next guest speaker, Mr. Micah Savage. Thanks for joining us, Micah.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So Micah Savage is a political officer and the INL director. Can you tell us what INL stands for, Micah?
The Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, basically working with police and judiciary.
Wonderful. And so that's his job here at U.S. Embassy Bishkek. He's previously served in Washington, D.C., and before that, he was in Kabul, in Afghanistan, in Nepal, and Kathmandu, and also in Bucharest, Romania. And of course, he was a Peace Corps volunteer too, right? You were in Peace Corps as well?
Yes, in the Republic of Moldova.
Wow, so here we are, all three. It's like a great reunion of Peace Corps across the world. Wonderful. All right, so to kick things off, Noel, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about the different programs that USAID does here in Kyrgyzstan to support free and fair elections, but then across the world in general as well.
Yeah, of course. So, as you already mentioned, we do support elections here in the Kyrgyz Republic, but, this is something that USAID does globally. I would say probably in over 100 countries around the world. And, the U.S. as a global promoter of democracy and good governance, this is something that we invest heavily in. And we do that through USAID, our Agency for International Development. So I would say, I don't have the exact figures, but I would say we've supported democratic elections here in the Kyrgyz Republic for at least the last 2 decades. And, today I'm going to kind of walk through a bit what that looks like. But one of the things I think is important to say right off the bat is that this is work that we do very closely with the Kyrgyz government in close collaboration. This is very much a partnership. We're very happy to be part of this partnership in helping the Kyrgyz Republic sort of develop as a democracy and working together towards democratic principles. So what does it look like when USAID supports the Kyrgyz Republic for elections? So it looks like a lot of different things. And maybe one of the first things I'll touch on, which isn't immediately obvious, is that a lot of the support we give happens well before elections. So this means working closely with the Central Election Commission to train their staff, to work with them on electoral legislation, trying to bring Kyrgyz legislation and Kyrgyz practices in line with international best practices, the best practices in international legislation. And this isn't just coming from the United States, this is coming from best practices from around the world. So we'd also be supporting, well before elections, we'd be supporting the Central Election Commission with things like equipment, that's voting equipment, or, this past summer, actually, we provided the CEC with equipment that would allow them to live stream all their committee meetings so that folks would have the opportunity to see the decisions that were being made with regard to the election and increase the transparency of the electoral process. So we do a lot of work with the CEC and other bodies sort of before an election. And then in the run-up to an election, obviously that work accelerates. So we would again, in partnership with the government, particularly with the CEC, work on training. So not just with core CEC staff members who might be based in Bishkek, but now training all the folks who will work in the different polling stations across the country. And of course, as you know, the Kyrgyz Republic has thousands of polling stations. So it's a huge job. It's mostly done by the government, but we provide technical assistance, we provide a support, we help with training, we help with bringing in experts, printing materials, that sort of thing. This last elections in October, we also helped with supporting personal protective equipment for folks to be working in the polling stations and for voters, so that the entire democratic process wouldn't present a health risk for folks going to the polls. I think a few other things that are of interest is we work very closely with the media in general, but together with the CEC and with others, we work to train journalists so that they understand the most recent electoral legislation, they understand what is supposed to happen in the voting process, and so that they can report on it accurately, they can provide truthful stories to the media, or excuse me, to the public, and then they can also understand what might be accurate or what might be disinformation. And that, I think, is something that we've seen across the world recently, is just a real increase in disinformation. So we're working closely with the government to try and reduce that around elections, which is obviously a very sensitive time. And as part of that, we do a lot of voter education. So working with civil society, with the CEC and others to help voters understand what they should expect when they go to the polling stations, to understand what the process is, and to make sure that everyone is exercising their democratic rights sort of freely and fairly, and getting to the polls and contributing. I think maybe a couple of the things that are worth mentioning is we support debates here. We're very proud to have supported with KTRK and some of the regional stations debates. So in the last October parliamentary elections, many of those debates were supported by USAID, and we're also looking to support presidential debates in the upcoming elections. And then lastly,
before you keep going, I'd love to hear a little bit more about debates and why we think it's important to support debates, and what is the role of a debate in an election, because I think this is an important point for me. I feel pretty strongly about this, but I'd love to hear your opinion, Noel.
You're already taking the fire away from my presentation, Nolan.
No, that's a good question. I mean, and it's a valid question. Why would the U.S. be sort of supporting debates in the Kyrgyz Republic? Well, first of all, we do this all over the place, but debates are really important, because what the U.S. and what other democracies promote is a sort of issue-based political platforms, right? So individuals and parties who are proposing a platform to the public, saying, this is what I stand for, this is what my party stands for, this is what we are proposing we can do for the Kyrgyz Republic and for the Kyrgyz people, right? So coming with ideas and coming with a platform of what they're going to accomplish if and when they come into office, right? So debates are really critical, because it's an opportunity for opponents, for candidates, to really have a discussion about what the different platforms mean. What does one candidate stand for vis-a-vis another candidate? And that exchange is really critical. It's one of the few times, I think, where voters will see a really unvarnished interaction between two parties or two candidates or two, in many cases, different beliefs about what's right for a country or wrong for a country. So it's a really fundamental sort of moment that I think is critical for voter education overall.
I agree. I'd love for you to jump in, Micah, as well. I don't want you to have to wait all the way until you, if you want to jump in and add something as well, I think that'd be great.
No, I was just giving you a hard time. I'll let Noel finish, and then we can have a discussion after we're both done.
Okay. No, because it's, if you look at the history of democracies around the world, a lot of elections are, determined by debates. The results are determined by debates. The most famous one in the United States is the famous debate between then candidate Nixon and candidate Kennedy. And candidate Kennedy came off as, young and handsome and well-spoken, and candidate Nixon did not come off like that. And a lot of people did make the decision based on that debate to vote John F. Kennedy in, which was a very, historic moment for the United States for a lot of reasons, but just from the sense that a debate and that 2 hours on the television was able to have such a determinative effect on an election. And I think that's it does show the value, because it does show the ability of people to help form their opinions through this vehicle, which is political debate. So thank you for that kind of explanation of why this is so important and why the United States supports it.
I think the most important thing to come out of that debate is, if you're a man, wear makeup on television because it makes you look alive. As I'm out by the bright light that's currently shined on me.
Well, next time I'll come over there with some blush and we'll fix you up, Micah.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Anyway, yeah, so that's perfect. So, I'll let you continue on. I just really wanted to touch on that point before you continued on with your presentation, Noel. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. And please jump in if you have more questions. So I was only going to cover one other topic, and that's observation. So USAID and US government supports observation in a number of different ways. So first of all, we have international observation. Myself and others from the embassy will go out and observe the election on election day, see what's happening, note any irregularities, and of course, report on that. But USAID also supports different types of observation. We support domestic, nonpartisan observation. So this is civil society groups, everyday individuals who get together to go out and observe the polling process, right? So this is really critical, because essentially any citizen under Kyrgyz law and under law in any sort of modern democracy can go to a polling station. You have to sign up and you have to, be willing to kind of be trained, but you can go to a polling station and you can watch the democratic process happen. You can see how votes, not who people vote for, obviously, but you can see people submitting votes. You can see the votes being counted. You can see that whole process. And that's really fundamental to trusting in the democratic system, to making yourself and those who sort of support observation, to make them understand how, I would say how, in the case of the Kyrgyz Republic, how good the system really is. I mean, it's a very sophisticated system to be able to calculate votes from across the country in a short period of time, but actually it's done quite well. And the folks who do it quite well. So anyway, we support civil society and other groups to do domestic observation, and we also train party poll watchers. So these are parties who send their people who are part of the party to polls throughout the country to observe themselves, right? Parties have their own right to observe the democratic process, and do so in the name of their party, to represent their interests, to make sure votes are being counted fairly. So we also train party poll watchers to do this.
Available to all parties, or is it just certain parties?
Yeah, no. So I was going to exactly make this point. So anytime the U.S. government, particularly USAID, offers something to one party, it has to be given to all parties. So we don't offer things to parties all that often. It's mostly training, really. But in this case, if we give it to one, if we train one party on how to do this or help them, then we would do the exact thing for every other party.
I like it. Fairness, which
Equal
goes back
opportunity.
to the root of the question, right? How to support a free and fair election.
That's right. So that was my opening sort of just explanation of the different work we do. And I'm happy to sort of turn it over to Micah or answer questions or just move into a conversation.
I think we can. I think we can go over to Micah. I did want to ask you about the nonpartisan domestic observers. Can you explain a little bit what it means for someone to be nonpartisan? Because I think that's an important point.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good clarifying question. So nonpartisan means you're not representing a political party, right? So you are an independent, nonpartisan observer, meaning you don't have a stake in the game, right? You don't care if candidate A or candidate B wins. You're just there to observe the process and ensure that the process itself is secure, valid, etc. Right? So these are organizations who look to support Kyrgyz democracy or the democracy in any country, and they observe the election. So that's different from what I was talking about, the party poll watchers, who are partisan observers, right? They're representing their party's interest when they observe at the polls, and ultimately both are important, and both are valid.
Exactly. I think that's a really important point as well. Is that all different groups get a chance to participate in the process, because the more people participating in the process, it leads to there's more accountability, there's more transparency, and so I think that's having these different groups involved: domestic, nonpartisan observers, party poll watchers, the poll people themselves, who are also there trying to support the integrity of the process, law enforcement, all of these, and then the election commission themselves, all of these different groups working together to try and create this free and fair election. I think that when you have all of them and each one is playing its role the way it should, I think that things can really turn out well. And so, I think that segues into our next conversation. Micah, tell us a little bit about, just kind of on a theoretical level, on a theoretical level, and then on a practical level, what does a free and fair election mean? What needs to happen for an election to be considered free and fair? What are the how does that happen? How are those judgments? How does that take place?
Sure, Nolan, I'm happy to do that, and I'm glad that you describe this as looking at it more in a theoretical way, at least to start, and then maybe we can talk about how it's done in reality in a conversation with our viewers today. But yeah, so what makes an election free and fair? As I originally thought about this question, it seemed like an easy question. But the more I thought about it, the more complex it became. So I guess let's start with the words free and fair, and then we can discuss elections afterwards. So free could be taken to mean without cost or without paying any money. We have a history in the United States of poll taxes in our past, or requiring people to have certain forms of identification that cost money, and that means that's not free anymore. These poll taxes have been challenged in the past and have been eliminated through our court system, but it is something to look out for when looking at elections in different countries. In essence, any voter should not have to pay any money to vote. They should be able to access the polling station in person or online that does not require any money to participate in. And then when you think about the word fair, I mean, that could also have a multitude of meanings. And in one sense, everyone should be playing under the same rules. That would be considered fair. For example, if one candidate requires 10,000 signatures in order to register their name to get on a ballot, another candidate should not require 20,000. They should all require the same. So there are some countries that try to ensure that candidates receive equal airtime on TV or on radio stations in order to make it fair. And I think this is pretty common amongst all countries. Money is almost always something that gives one person that has more money more of an advantage. And because I know the United States the best, I'll take that as an example. Those candidates who are able to raise more money can buy more advertising time, more bumper stickers, more signs that supporters can put in their yard. And so we sort of explain this away as people and corporations donating a limited amount of money to support candidates, and it's their right to, it's their freedom of expression to use that money as a way to express their support for a candidate. But I think clearly a richer candidate can either spend its own money, or a more charismatic candidate can convince more people to give them more money. And so that could end up being considered an unfair advantage. And then the other word to more fully define is an election, which is obviously the hallmark of democracies. Authoritarian states don't typically have elections, or if they do have elections, they're not really competitive. Everyone knows ahead of time who's going to win. And there are many types of elections in democracies with different ways to gauge who ends up winning. But elections can be a primary tool to foster political openings and expand political participation, and just talk about issues more openly, which goes back to Noel's discussion of debates and why they're important. But I think the main idea of elections is that all citizens, at least above a certain age.
It's interesting. I want to jump in.
Go ahead.
I want to jump in before we got too far. I just wanted to, for our viewers, our other guest speaker will be back. He got called away for an emergency phone call, but he will be back. He hasn't left us yet. He hasn't gone on a trek to those beautiful mountains that you see in the background. So before you go too far, I really wanted to point out something that you said that is really poignant for me about the poll taxes, and that those were challenged as being basically not free and not fair, and eventually they were struck down due to the civil rights movement. And I think it goes back to something that Noel said about what are election best practices, these kind of things, these kind of changes that we support are changes that we ourselves have done in the past, or that others have done in the past. And we're all working constantly to improve an election system to make sure it becomes more free and more fair, because frankly, there is no perfect election system. There's no perfect democracy. It's something that we're all working towards, and it's a struggle that we're all trying to make. And I think that was something I just wanted to mention in reference to poll taxes. Would you agree with that? Or?
I completely agree with that. And you're actually ahead of my presentation again a little bit. But just very briefly, we are all in democratic societies working towards an ideal. We're all trying to get better constantly. We're trying to make our elections freer, fair, more protected, to prevent outside influence, changing things. So it's something that we all continue to work on. And I wouldn't say the United States is necessarily the best country at elections. Each country has different strengths. The type of system we use in the United States, other countries might think that parliamentary elections are more democratic, or the fact that we do single mandate voting, where we vote for individual candidates, is less or more democratic than the party system that Kyrgyzstan uses. I think we're all just trying to represent the will of the people in a better way and continually improve. But it is an ideal that we keep striving for, and I don't think any country in the world has pure, fair, and free elections. I think there's always some things that can be better.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that having voted in quite a few, not that many elections, but a few elections myself. The thing that always strikes me as well is that, it's funny because in America, the elections that get the most kind of attention and press are the presidential elections, of course. It's like the focus of, constant media coverage 24/7 for, a year in advance of what's happening, who's going to run, who's going to be in the primaries and everything like that. But what's fascinating is that on a day-to-day level, your mayor probably has more of an effect on your life in the United States or your governor than the president. The president is a very important person and plays a very important role, especially at the global level. But your day-to-day life is, the mayor is the one who's organizing and making sure that your streets are cleaned, that that your schools are well equipped and that have teachers, and managing the police forces. And so it's really very interesting to me about how there's kind of a mismatch between, the public perception of, the importance of an election, especially in the United States, for a certain post, and the actual, weight that post has on someone's life. I don't know if you'd care to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. Our federal presidential elections definitely get the most attention, and I think voter participation rates go down by 15 or 20% in the United States when it's not a presidential election versus a presidential election year, and I think that's mainly due to the fact that people recognize the president. They don't always recognize their senators or representatives. And particularly at the local level, a lot of people may know their mayor, but we have plenty of elections for judges and for county commissioners at the local level. And I mean, I voted not too long ago. I'm from the great state of Pennsylvania. I will tell you, I had no idea who most of the people that were on my ballot. I had to go and do a little internet research, try to figure out a little more about them. But these people are representing me, but I don't know who they are. But I recognize the president.
Well, maybe we need to ask USAID for a voter education program in the United States. Just kidding.
Probably.
No, but no, it's funny because we have we have our own, in the United States, we have our own non-governmental organizations that play a nonpartisan role in educating voters. I remember, my first election, I opened up there's like a book that they mailed to everyone's house that the League of Women Voters mailed to everyone. And they asked all the candidates the same questions, and they, trying to get the information out to the voters, because in the United States, the same kind of voter education projects occur, even though a lot of times it's done by, kind of grassroots non-governmental organizations, but they're doing the exact same things in terms of voter education that we support overseas.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I think
have you guys ever
worked
on election campaigns or done that kind of voter education stuff in the United States?
I have a personal story about that, actually. Yeah. My father ran for office 4 times throughout my childhood. He was a district magistrate, and in Pennsylvania, they are elected to 6-year terms. So I actually spent a fair amount of time driving around with my father, putting yard signs into people's yards who were willing. We also had to get signatures, and judges in Pennsylvania are allowed to run as both a Democrat and a Republican. And it was really funny because we could basically, because my county where I grew up is heavily Republican, we were basically able to just leave signature sheets in popular restaurants around in the different towns, and they would be filled out very quickly within a couple of days, and it was not a problem. But since there weren't so many Democrats, we literally had to take the list of Democrats, call them up and ask them if they'd be willing to sign, and then drive to their house and get them to sign in order to get the 1,500 signatures that we needed. But that's how we had to do elections. You needed to get onto the ballot in the first place. But that's just a personal story. No, I've not done any other sorts of campaigning besides standing by my father in at town carnivals and fairs and just trying to wave and look cute so that they thought that my dad was a good father, which he was, to vote him into office.
That's great. I love that story. I love the idea of you getting trucked around staking political signs into people's yards. That's fantastic. What about you, Noel?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry for jumping away for a second. I have an emergency phone here that I just have for this week, and it rang sort of all the time. So apologies. So I've definitely volunteered on campaigns, and it's a really interesting experience. volunteered on a couple presidential campaigns, going out, knocking on doors, providing information, making sure people are, able to get to the polls if they want to vote, that sort of thing. So it's something I would highly recommend, no matter what country you live in, is volunteering for a political cause you believe in.
Yeah, I can say I haven't done as much partisan stuff, but I can say that in the university, I used to just register voters. Basically, I was deputized to register voters, and I set up a table in advance of the election and was like just trying to register people to vote. For me, it wasn't necessarily. It goes back to the nonpartisan idea. It's like I just support the democratic process. I support people making their decision, providing their choice, having input in the system, because the way I looked at it was the more people involved, the better the results will be for everyone, and the more legitimacy the results will have. So, I think that I agree with you completely. It is something really special to be a part of that and to volunteer in those kind of ways to support your country's development as a democracy and to support your fellow citizens. So that's fantastic. So I guess
I should note that that was my young days as a college student. Now that I'm a diplomat, I can't do that sort of thing anymore. Now everything I do has to be nonpartisan.
That's true. We all take that pledge to be nonpartisan.
That's also important.
Yep. And it's one we fulfill faithfully and one we fulfill with pleasure, because it's important for us to know that we're going to faithfully serve whatever government and whatever leadership is voted in, and we unite behind that leader and faithfully execute the foreign policy that leader decides, along with his closest advisors. And that's something that I really that is the responsibility of the faithful civil servant, and that's what we are. And I think it's funny because we're all Peace Corps volunteers, and so that service is very much in our our Constitution and who we are. So I think that's something really special. So I think we can jump in, and I'd like to ask you guys a couple before we get to the audience's questions. I'd like to ask you guys a couple questions just to kind of start things off. What
can I just add one thing?
Yes, of course.
So I would just add one thing real quick. I would just like to point out that our foreign policy, the United States foreign policy, doesn't really change that much depending on who the president or the Senate is. I've been actually very impressed, having worked under Democratic and Republican administrations, that we support pretty much the same thing regardless, that we're still promoting human rights. We still want to promote democracy. We still want to promote openness and fairness and free media. So I found that part actually to be very, very easy, that our priorities don't change depending on the leader. So I just wanted to make that point, and feel free to ask us your question.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. You cut out there. I didn't hear your last bit. But yeah, I think that's a very, very important point, that there's certain things that are constant. And I think that's because a lot of those values that you mentioned, support for democracy and human rights and free media and everything like that, those values don't change. Those values are constant and something that we continue supporting. So it is, that does, like you said, that does make it, at least for us, in terms of knowing what our mission is, it does make it a little bit clearer about what we're here to do and what we're here to do with our partners. So before we get into the questions from the audience, I'd love to hear thoughts on a few different things. I think that up to this point, we've talked about what makes an election free and fair, and we've really only kind of barely touched on what are the threats to a free and fair election. What makes an election not free? What makes an election not fair? What are the things that in the world today, not that people can see where an election is not a free and fair election? What is that? What are some of those things that make an election not free or fair?
Did you want to go, Noel, or should I go? I think the biggest threat is if the administration that is in power does not give equal airtime or equal access, or works to ensure that the voices of the competing party is not heard. So I think if there are authoritarian governments in the world that don't allow their competitors to be heard, and they will file lawsuits or shut down TV and radio stations that are giving voice to their competitors. And when a candidate can't talk to the people and can't spread their message, openly, and have the same sort of level playing field as the administration in power, then I think that is probably the biggest threat to free and fair elections.
Yeah, I think I could jump in a few others. I think that are really important is one, I think, is just maintaining the independence of any election authorities, election agency, in the case of Kyrgyzstan, the Central Election Commission. Really having a body that can be independent, that can operate according to its own mandate, and conduct a nonpartisan election process is really critical. And so I think one of the biggest threats that you see across the world is when a ruling administration seeks to affect the nonpartisan nature of their election authority, right? They seek to sort of tip the scales in their favor by putting in folks into that authority that favor them, or changing the laws in a way that favors them, et cetera. So I think that's a big one that you see almost in all sort of developing democracies. As I mentioned earlier, I think disinformation is a huge and growing threat. It's not just sort of misinformation, meaning information that's sort of patently false that's being put out, but you also see a lot of this work developing over social media, where you have sort of incorrect information that's deliberately circulated with the intention to deceive people. You have bots or trolls who are paid folks online who are commenting in a certain way or sharing certain material that present themselves as a sort of independent, real citizen, when in fact they're actually just a paid promoter of one party or one candidate. So I think that's another large threat to democracy around the world.
Yeah, I think you both made really important points, and I think it goes back to a word that we've mentioned a few times, which is competition. And you want to have as much open competition as possible. In a situation where parties aren't allowed to compete, or due to unfair practices, or when other parties provide themselves with an advantage in the competition by engaging with trolls and others. I mean, that it's unfairly tilting the ground, and it's going against the interests of the country and against the interests of the voter. So I think that's something that it's important to remember, is that at the end of the day, what is the election supposed to do? The election is supposed to, in theory, provide the most capable government with the best program for society. And also to me, the beautiful part about an election is that, frankly, like if you're at work and you're not getting along with your boss, you can't vote your boss out. You're not necessarily, you can't do that. And so the beautiful thing about a free and fair election is that if you are not satisfied with how things are going, you have a way to hold that person responsible. And when elections are not free and not fair, then it takes that power away from the citizen. And when the citizen loses that power, it's very dangerous because, once they lose the power to hold their government accountable, then the next thing you know, they might lose their power to defend themselves against arbitrary, acts by the government to seize their property or to jail them without cause or to restrict their freedom of speech. And so, that election is really the key. And if the citizen loses that free and fair election, then all of those other rights start to come under threat. And I think that really gets to why free and fair elections are so important, because they do play such a role in preserving all of the other freedoms that citizens enjoy.
Yeah, Nolan, I think you're sort of skirting around a major part of a functioning democracies is an independent judiciary, a court system that is not able to be influenced and looks purely at the law as a way of trying to decide who's right and who's wrong, so that when the government, or if a government tries to take away these rights, the citizens can sue the government and be allowed legally or claim the damages. So an independent judiciary is really a keystone to making sure that elections are free and fair and end up following the will of the people, who they're actually voting for.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. All right, well, I think that we're about 40 minutes in, so I want to open up and start looking through some of the questions and comments we have here. So I'll just be noting some of the comments. So here, Hilola, thank you for the heart eyes comment. I really appreciate that. That's very encouraging to know that we're receiving some fan sympathy. So I appreciate your support for our panel. I'm going to assume that was destined for my other colleagues here and not myself. So we also have another comment here from Maksat Ratayev, who says whether voters in the United States chose Donald Trump or Joe Biden is dependent on how they see the response to the coronavirus pandemic, views on abortion, and a handful of other key issues. I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, I think in general, most elections, people are going to be making their decisions based on a few different issues. I mean, frankly, just myself and others, everyone I know, most people are not political scientists. Most people are not political experts. Most people have a lot of things going on, and they don't have a chance to be a so-called expert on all these elections. So they do make their choices based off on a few issues because they're constrained by time, like everyone else. So that's a very important insight. Thank you, Maksat.
I would just add that I just wanted to add that we have a fair amount of what we call single issue voters in the United States. That they feel very strongly about gun rights, or they feel very strongly about abortion, and so regardless of whatever else that particular candidate might be advocating for, they vote purely based on that one issue that they feel really strongly about.
Yeah, so that is, I admire their courage of convictions. I guess that I don't necessarily consider myself a single issue voter, but I completely understand, and that is something that definitely is a very important factor in the American political system. So from Manas, we have a question here. What changes or progress have you seen in the election system of Kyrgyzstan during the last observation, or during the, I don't know if this necessarily means during the last election or, since then, but, I know that you two kind of study this issue. So if you want to talk about any changes that were made in the run up to the last election that you think were positive, please feel free.
Yeah, I can offer some thoughts. I think, this isn't something that was necessarily specific to the last election, but I think has been true for a couple elections now. The Kyrgyz Republic, I think, for a long time struggled with having a secure election day process, right? And they implemented biometric registration. They implemented automatic electric polling boxes. And as a result of that and a lot of hard work by the government, the Central Election Commission, and a lot of dedicated commissioners, the result is that actually on election day, Kyrgyz elections are very secure. And you can see that throughout all the observation reports, whether it's the OSCE observation or local organizations who have observed it. What happens in the polling booth for the large part is very secure, and that's a huge leap forward for Kyrgyz democracy. I mean, that's really an impressive that's really impressive progress. But what it's also meant is that you've seen, also noted by a number of observers, you've seen attempts at electoral fraud move from the polling booth, where perhaps it used to be, or where it is in many countries, into other aspects. So you have, for example, the supposed abuse of Form 2, right? Or vote buying. These are things that don't happen on election day inside the polling booth, right? It's a separate type of fraud. So, that might, the fact that there may be vote buying obviously seems negative, but the reality is it's actually a consequence of positive developments in other ways. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
And you did mention some of these issues like the abuse of Form 2. My understanding is that the Kyrgyz government itself has recognized that that was a problem in the last election and has severely restricted the use of that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So the existing parliament has actually banned the use of Form 2 for Kyrgyz who are currently residing in the Kyrgyz Republic. I believe it can still be used for folks abroad. But no, I mean, these are not sort of my own views or U.S. government views. I'm talking about views that the Kyrgyz government has understood and has acted on.
That's really interesting. Do you have anything to add to that one, Micah, or should we continue on?
No, Noel is the expert on the mechanics, so I will let his answer stand.
All right, perfect. All right, well, we've got another comment here from Maksat. So this is also a very observant comment. It says, democratization in fragile states is a complex process that cannot be rushed nor taken for granted. All parties should be cognizant of certain realities. First, there's no such thing as an instant democracy. No assumption should be made about the capacity of fragile states to fulfill their democratic aspirations, nor should their capacity to do so be underestimated. What is important is that whatever the capacity of the newly formed state to transform itself. Yeah, so I think that I don't have a lot to say about that, but I think that, I think that goes back to what we were talking about before, that, each democracy is kind of on this constant uphill slope, and that we're all striving towards this ideal of perfection that we'll never attain. But that, as democracies, I think that we should help one another and that we should assist one another in getting up that hill and in continuing to progress. And I think that that's, when I hear Noel talking about partnership with the Central Election Commission and, and all of the things that we work together with them on, whether it's making their deliberations more transparent or, supporting training for their election officials, it really, to me, goes back to that point that, yes, there is no perfect democracy, but together we can always make strides towards perfection. And I think that's something that, that I'll definitely be taking away from this discussion. Do you have any other comments that you want to give on that one, guys?
No, that was good.
No? Okay. Perfect. So here's an interesting question. So this is from Mahabat Melisbekova. So thank you for that question, Mahabat. That's a really interesting question. How does early voting work? And so I think we're going to assume that this is about the United States here, so we can kind of jump in there. And I'll let you two guys jump in on this, because I think we all probably voted early due to the fact that we're overseas. So go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say I wasn't aware of any early voting for Kyrgyzstan, so I'm glad that you specified for the United States. Well, My experience was that I had to basically send an email to my hometown and say, hey, I'm not going to be in my hometown for the election because I live in Kyrgyzstan. So please send me a ballot. And so they mailed me a ballot that I then had to be very careful with because it required like putting certain forms in certain envelopes, signing the envelopes, and putting that envelope inside another security envelope that then went into a package that I sent back. So they were very, very like specific on their instructions. And then I was a witness for my wife who votes in Virginia, and they had a completely different process, which I thought was interesting. But still, it was similar in that we had to apply early, but she actually had to um, mail something. She didn't email. She went to a website and then got it, and then had to mail her ballot in once she received it. And so while I was able to mail mine, my wife actually took hers to an actual box. That it was sort of a show of faith because it was not a protected box. There was no guard standing by the box, but it had official ballot box written all over. It was in a designated location, and people just came up and slipped their ballots into that, and that was counted early. And then since Pennsylvania was so famous this last election for being an important swing state to determine the outcome of the election, I was looking to see if my ballot was counted. And even though I voted month and a half before, I sent my ballot in a month and a half beforehand, on the day of the election, my vote wasn't counted. On the day after, my vote wasn't counted. It took 4 days after the election, and I come from a very small county, so there's not that many votes there. But it took 4 days after the election for my vote to actually be counted and processed and fill into the statewide numbers for the election. So that was my experience.
Were you let me ask you, on the third day, were you like, guys, are you gonna were you starting to on the third day?
I was trying to maintain faith in the system that my vote would eventually be counted, but I thought it was really nice that I was able to check online and see that my vote was there. It just hadn't been counted yet. So I wasn't too worried, but I definitely had friends and family who were very interested in the outcome of the Pennsylvania election, which basically swayed the entire election, who kept saying, "Did your vote count yet? Did your vote count yet?" So I felt very popular. A lot of people were interested in my vote this year.
That's funny. What about you, Noel? I saw that you're originally from Alaska, correct?
I am from Alaska, although I now vote in Missouri, which is where my wife is from.
Okay.
So that's my voting state. And in answer to Mahabat's question, how does early voting work? I would say it actually works 50 different ways in the United States because every state is in charge of their own voting. And so they all have their own process. I mean, many are very similar, but they all have their own thing. So I was actually in Missouri visiting, and I went to the county courthouse, and I sort of spoke with an election official, verified my information, gave them my ID, I received a ballot. I kind of walked outside. There were these voting booths with, for privacy. And I went in there and filled it out. And then like Micah, there were like 3 envelopes. You had to sort of make sure it was 100% secure. And then you sign on the outside so that no one can sort of open it or do anything with it. And then I handed it in, and that was it. It was quite easy.
Wow. So, I mean, they did, especially this year, I believe they made, and it's interesting. There was a question, how is 2020 election different from previous years? There were efforts made to facilitate voting by mail. And so I think that's, of course, and it was done, each state was deciding what those efforts would be. with the consent and approval of their legislature and governor, because each state sets its own rules. But I am glad that efforts were made to facilitate voting by mail and early voting, so that you wouldn't have a crush of voters on the day of the election. So I think that's really important. And I think this is probably going to be our last question. And this kind of goes back to one of the others, and this is again from Maksatbek Patayev. So he says, how do you see, what do you think about the e-voting system? If you think it is possible to launch the e-voting system, what are the considerations regarding cybersecurity? So I'll let you. I have my own thoughts about that one, but I'll let you guys jump on it as well.
Yeah, I can take a first stab at that. I mean, we do so much through the internet that I really think that we should be moving towards e-voting. Especially, it was important this year because of the coronavirus pandemic and how we didn't want people to congregate in groups. But I think it's important that should be an option going forward for all elections, because there are people that, people with disabilities that can't easily leave their house, people who are sick, people who are far away. I vote in Pennsylvania, but I don't usually live there. I'm usually abroad or away. So I think that e-voting is important. It should be the wave of the future, with all of the protections that we can possibly do to make it as secure as possible. But I do like that, at least in most elections, is that there's a paper ballot. So I would be okay until we feel like we're 100% sure of like cybersecurity issues of voting online, but then also sending a paper ballot. And so we would then be able to tally election results very, very quickly. Then there would be, take a couple weeks to count ballots paper way manually, and make sure that they come out to the same answer or very close. If you have millions of votes, if you're off by a couple hundred or 1,000, fine, but it should be pretty close. And I think if we did that for a few election cycles and we could prove that our cybersecurity was sufficient, then we would gain enough faith in the e-voting system to move to it full time.
Excellent answer. Couldn't have come up with anything better myself. What about you, Noel?
I'm not quite so confident we're ready to move into full e-voting. But Mike, I think you raised a lot of the really critical points. You need redundant systems, right? So it's fine to do it electronically, but you need a paper backup, or you need some other backup that will allow both you yourself, right? Like Micah, I loved how you went in and checked online. Was my vote counted? Was my vote counted, right? So you're holding the system accountable, but then you also need states and other agencies to be able to do an audit of the system, right? And to be able to understand, to compare the different redundant systems against each other. Are they coming up with the same calculations? Are they not? What are the differences? Being able to understand and feel confident about the system. I mean, even if we get to a point, and I hope this is one day true, where cybersecurity is no longer an issue, Mike, as you suggested, I still think we should have redundant systems, because it's the redundancy that allows those systems not to be compromised. If you have multiple systems, it's just that much harder. And so I think just as a preventative measure, it's important to have these. I like, maybe I'm old fashioned, but I do like a little paper in my voting process.
Oh, of course. I mean, I still remember going to the voting booth, where it was a booth and there was a big crank that you would pull down. This is in the 80s, and I'd go into the booth with my mom and dad, and they'd crank that thing, and it would go into the ballot where all the others were, and that was how they would actually, by moving the levers and everything like that. It's like that is the most secure thing in the entire world. And I do like the point, of having that redundancy. And I think that, this all goes back to legitimacy and how people feel about the elections. Do they feel that the elections are secure? Do they feel that the elections are free? Do they feel that the elections are fair? And, I think that there's a lot of what we have to do together as citizens, wherever we are, to, talk with one another and figure out what it is that we can do to give that sense of legitimacy to these elections. And legitimacy is conferred by creating those conditions, by creating those free and fair conditions. So with that, I'll stop, but I'd like to offer it to you guys if you have any final words that you'd like to share with the audience for this evening.
I would say be engaged and go vote in your own elections, assuming you're old enough. And, be engaged in the politics around you and the political processes of your country. Whether you want to be partisan or nonpartisan, I would just say be involved.
Yeah,
that's a good message.
Yeah, I would agree with Noel. It's the only way to hold your leaders accountable and make sure that you end up with the type of government that you want. Is go vote.
Yes. And so with that, I'll thank you all viewers again for joining us this evening. It's really been a pleasure seeing your comments, seeing your questions, seeing how strongly you feel about this issue, and reading some of your insights into this issue and sharing some of our thoughts with you. This is really the kind of thing that I love being a diplomat, because here we are working together as citizens in our respective democracies to make things better, and that's something to be celebrated. And I enjoy evenings like this because it is a celebration of that, and I'm looking forward to the next time we get to chat. So with that, thank you as well to our guests, and I wish all of you a great evening. Bye now.